Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Certainly want to thank Nick Pitts yesterday for covering the program. And, of course, he spent some time talking about the State of the Union address. I thought I would come back to that for just a little bit on a different note, and that is, do we need to fact-check the fact-checkers? And you will see that two of the articles we've posted there really get into that issue. Then I want to move on to some of the things in the news. The Green New Deal is something I wrote about yesterday. It was in the commentary. Today, one on climate change activism. But especially since I wrote about the Green New Deal, which is actually the second time I've written about it, now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez goes into more detail. And sometimes when you write about this, you say, okay, am I being fair? Is it possibility that maybe she knows something? Maybe some of the other proponents know some things. Maybe we misread some of that. And so she has given a very significant overview of the Green New Deal, which we'll get to a little bit later. And, of course, yesterday my argument was just sort of twofold. Only two things you really need to know about it. Number one, it recalls half of our troops, wants to actually cut military in half. Does that sound like a good idea in the Middle East, for example, or in South Korea? And then number two, it is specifying that we want to completely move away from fossil fuels to renewable power. And given the fact that about 88% of the energy right now comes from those sources, do we really think that in 10 years we can move it from, again, you can kind of figure the numbers here, 12%, some people say 16% to 100%. I mean, really, let's deal with that. But then it gets into a lot more. And as you begin to hear a little bit more, pretty amazing. I hope you don't want to get on an airplane, because air travel will stop unless it's absolutely necessary. All sorts of jobs will be unionized. There'll be a carbon tax. There'll be a cap and trade. We'll get into that a little bit later, but just thought let you know what some people are talking about right now. And for those of you like me that think, well, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, because after all, this is not going to be part of the Democratic platform. One of the articles that came out today in the Wall Street Journal, which we are going to focus on more tomorrow in our weekend edition, we have Jeremy Dice with us and Debbie Georgiadis, is a whole outlining here of the various positions and what they really mean. And this was done by the editorial board. And I like one of their basic arguments here, that you can assume that some of this will never happen because it wouldn't pass. But you can also assume that individuals wouldn't be talking about it if they didn't think that it was possible. I mean, just think about what you want to do when you're running as a candidate for the presidency on the Democratic Party. You aren't going to put out things that people say, look, this is never going to happen. You're just wasting your airtime on this particular issue. And, of course, they honestly believe that some of this not only needs to take place, but actually will take place and will happen in the future. So anyway, that's just a little bit of an overview, what we'll get into later. But if you saw the speech by President Donald Trump, I think there were surprises all over the mainstream media, because CBS actually put out a poll very quickly, and you've seen it all over Facebook if you've been on Facebook at all. 76% of viewers approved of the address, 24% disapproved. Now, this is the first example I think we can talk about of sort of fact-checking, because, okay,
76%, 24%. But most of the people that were putting this out there, because there was a CNN poll, there was a CBS poll, and all the others, made it real clear early on that, well, this might just be skewed a little bit because the individuals that are more likely to support Donald Trump watched that particular address. And you know what? That's true. Now, I would love to have access to some of the reports that came out, say, 8 years ago and 10 years ago and things like that, if all those kinds of disclaimers were issued when President Barack Obama was speaking, because we all understand that that oftentimes takes the place. But given the fact that they were expecting that this would not be that popular, 76%, they had to find some ways to give you some disclaimers. And one of those is to say, well, approval among Republicans was so high that it skewed the numbers. Okay, let's look at those for just a minute, and then we'll get into some other issues. Yes, 97% of Republicans actually approved of the address. Now, you might say, well, that's what I expect. That's not what I expect. I mean, it is hard to find 97% of Republicans to agree on just about anything. And given the fact that some Republicans are going to be in the category of the never-Trumpers, and others that are, in one way or another appalled by something the president has done, certainly something he has said, 97% is off the charts. But then again, you might say, well, yeah, but then let's look at the swing vote, the independents. 82% of independents approved of it. And so actually that 76% would have been even higher if it weren't for the fact that you only had 30% of Democrats that approved of it. If those numbers had been slightly higher, this would have been maybe the all-time record. And it will be interesting to see how this plays out. I've mentioned on this program before that after Donald Trump did his special presentation in the Oval Office, his approval numbers went down a little bit, which is very rare. Usually when people see the president or they see a presidential candidate, the presence there reminds them of that, and so those numbers go up. And those actually went down. I have seen that before. They used to joke during the campaign a couple of years ago that the best way for Hillary Clinton to get her approval numbers up was to not say anything, because oftentimes when she would speak, her numbers would go down. But that is very, very rare. And there's every reason to believe that this might have been very significant as a change in some of the conversation. Real quickly, before we get into some of the fact-checking, Gary Bauer kind of did, again, an analysis of the fact that this snap poll from CBS and CNN, not Fox News, by the way, 76%, but then talked about some of those, the economy, some of the accomplishments that were taking place there, the economic gains made by women, then, but which is interesting enough, when he said that, the newly elected women, at least in white, sat on their hands. They did stand up later on when he talked about the incredible number of women in Congress. We're going to talk about that in terms of fact-checking in just a minute. Then, of course, made his case for border security. One of the arguments he made here is no issue better illustrates the divide between America's working class and America's political class than illegal immigration. Wealthy politicians and donors push to open borders while living their lives between walls and gates and guards. Meanwhile, working-class Americans are left to pay the price for mass illegal immigration, reduced jobs, lower wages, overburdened schools and hospitals, increased crime, and a depleted social safety net. And so he certainly talked about that. And just before we take a break, though, of course, one of the things that is still striking to me, some of the statements that this individual, who a couple of years ago I wouldn't have even thought would have been pro-life, but nevertheless, President Donald Trump, ends his whole discussion about this defense of life by saying all children, born and unborn, are made in the holy image of God. So lots of things which were said. We will get to those a little bit later. But when we come back, I want to talk about some of the fact checks. And it's just a good illustration of the fact that you need to have some discernment and maybe read widely, because some of these fact checks themselves need to be fact checked. And so we're going to do that here on Point of View. Now, there's a couple of things that the president said that probably were stretched a little bit too, so we'll try to cover all of those right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Turn on a television or open up a newspaper and you will be treated to what best can be called climate change alarmism. We're told that we are headed for a climate catastrophe if we don't act immediately. Of course, we've heard that before. Back in 1970, Harvard biologist George Wald predicted civilization will end within 15 to 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. A few years later, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich predicted that 1 billion people would be starving to death by 2020. Climate change alarmism today succeeds first in discounting any critics and then by warning that dire consequences are just a few years off. Meteorologist Dr. Roy Spencer recently wrote about this first issue. He says climate change advocates claim that anyone who disagrees with them is a climate change denier. He says this is a straw man argument where you argue against something your opponent never claims. Spencer says he cannot think of a single credentialed, published skeptical climate scientist who doesn't believe in the existence of climate change. This includes Dr. Patrick Michaels, Dr. Richard Lenzin, and others who have been labeled climate change deniers. And the last 2 decades have been full of dire warnings. In his Oscar-winning documentary, Al Gore warned that sea levels would rise by 20 feet in the near future. So far, his prediction has been off by 20 feet or so. A 2005 conference of climate scientists and politicians meeting in London warned that the world has as little as 10 years before it would reach the point of no return on global warming. Alarmists and doomsayers have been with us for decades, warning of an environmental catastrophe that still hasn't happened. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just want to talk about some of the fact checks here. And again, as I've said before, I think sometimes it's important to fact check the fact checkers. And so we're going to look at just a couple of those. The first one comes from the Daily Signal. Jarrett Stepman, who I've quoted before, and a number of his associates put together 13. I don't know if I'll look at all 13, but we'll get at least a few that cause some concern to some of the liberal fact checkers, and even cause some concerns for the Daily Signal, which is more associated with the Heritage Foundation and conservative groups. So we'll try to cover all of those. And the first one is about the number of jobs created. President Donald Trump said we've created 5.3 million new jobs and importantly added 600,000 new manufacturing jobs, something which almost everyone said was impossible to do. But the fact is we're just getting started. And so, of course, he was talking about his economic development. And if you count from when he took office, January 20th to 2017 to now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics say, well, that's really 4.9 million jobs rather than 5.3 million jobs. My advice to the president is just to round and just say, 5 million jobs. Leave it at that. Somebody says, well, it's 4.9. As you'll see in just a minute, that still won't appease some of these kind of liberal fact checkers who just are trying to find anywhere where they can slight the president. But I think maybe the way he comes up with this number is that he looks at some of the things that happened before he took the oath of office January 20th. Is that fair? I don't know. Some people believe that even before he came into office, there was kind of an economic boomlet because people knew what he was probably going to bring to the Oval Office. So this is one where, again, you have seen some of those statements. The New York Times said, this is false. We have created 5.3 million new jobs.
Then you read the New York Times, and it says the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that since January 2017, the time he took office, the economy added 4.9. Are we going to quibble about that? Well, I guess some do. I'm not. Here's another one. Now, this is one where I think the president, again, where did he get this number? Nearly 5 million Americans have been lifted off of food stamps. Now, if you look at what has happened since he's taken office from January 2017 to September 2018, why can't we go any further? Well, that's the end of the kind of the, if you will, the fiscal year. And that was a decrease of 4.1 million. But if you go back a little bit earlier, we went from 45 million to 40 million. So again, if he goes a little further back, he talks about we've lifted 5 million off of food stamps. He didn't say I did it, but at the same time, again, the fact checkers really get kind of nitpicky a little bit about some of these issues. He has some about I guess I better take on this one. This one got him in all sorts of trouble, and again, I think it was unjustified. Tolerance for illegal immigration is not compassionate. It is cruel. 1 in 3 women is sexually assaulted on the long journey north. Now, if you look at some of the numbers that have been put together, and there are a couple, and now I'm going to move to the other one from Breitbart because that's where the argument was. Well, he says 1 in 3, or he says 30%. 1 in 3 is just not right because it was actually 31%. And again, this quibbling over, well, 1 in 3 should be 33%. And since it was 31%, that is false, or, again, is just an illustration of the way in which some of this fact-checking has been taking place. Here's another one. The Savage Gang, MS-13, now operates in 20 different American states, and they almost all come through our southern border. Just yesterday, an MS-13 gang member was taken into custody for a fatal shooting on a subway platform in New York City. Well, if you look at some of the other numbers from the past, there are suggestions, at least from a Time magazine article, that actually they had found MS-13 members in 42 states. Now, maybe, again, he's using numbers that come, say, from the Justice Department. So, if anything, you would have to accuse him of anything of rounding the number down, saying 20 different American states, when at some time there was a report of MS-13 in 42 states. But, again, we'll let that one go. There are a couple of others. San Diego is a good example here. It used to have the most illegal border crossings in the country. In response, a strong security wall was put in place. This powerful barrier almost completely ended illegal immigration and crossings. Again, the argument that some are making is, well, there were all sorts of other things besides the wall. Okay, I understand that, and a wall is part of that, but a wall tends to funnel people in particular directions. And whenever people try to prove a negative, whether it's the president trying to prove it or the fact checkers trying to, it's just always hard to prove a negative. Let's back off from the wall for just a minute, take something else. You would, on some coastlines, have people suggesting, we just need to tear down some of these lighthouses. Why? Well, we've never had a ship crash on the reef, so why do we need a lighthouse? That's maybe because we have a lighthouse. They say, oh, no. We have GPS and everything now, so we don't need those lighthouses. Well, okay, what about a ship that has a momentary failure in terms of its energy, or the GPS doesn't work, or the radar doesn't work, or somebody isn't paying attention? Just seeing the lighthouse in the distance would keep you from crashing on the shore. And so, again, when you try to prove a negative, really difficult to do. A couple more here as well. This new era of cooperation can start with finally confirming the more than 300 highly qualified nominees who are still stuck in the Senate, some after years and years of waiting. Well, the response from Jarrett Stepman and some of the other individuals is that he, in trying to push bipartisanship, really was calling for the Senate to confirm more nominees. And if you're not familiar with that, this is a conversation we had so many times with Kelly Shackelford about the fact that even the Democrats in the Senate, when they have a nominee that they would agree with, they would still slow walk it. They would actually call for 30 hours of debate
even if this was a nominee that actually had been put forward by Barack Obama, that was still sort of in the pipeline. So it shows that this has been an attempt to really begin to slow down the process. And I think that's one fact check that he actually deserves credit for raising the issue for people to understand that as well. He talked about the issue of drugs and the fact that vastly more people in other countries pay certainly a lot less than Americans pay for the same drugs in other countries, and often made, as he said, in the exact same place. This is wrong, unfair, and together we can stop it. And that is, of course, a case that could be made for a variety of different reasons. The Associated Press dealt with this by saying the Consumer Price Index for prescription drugs shows 0.6% reduction in prices from December 2018 when compared with December 2017, the biggest drop in nearly 50 years. However, that same index showed a 1.6% increase compared to the full 12 months. So it depends, again, which numbers you pick in order to do so. But I would have to say that that one certainly wouldn't be a difficulty. And so it brings me to one more before we take a break, and that is Donald Trump said, "We have unleashed a revolution in American energy. The United States is now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world, and now for the first time in 65 years, we are a net exporter of energy." And so if you look at some of the things that are out there, the Energy Department announced that our oil output actually has surpassed that of Russia. And so we are the leading, if you will, crude oil producer in the world. So in some respects, that could be said. And there are others that are convinced that we are also the leading producer of natural gas. But when we come back from the break, though, I'll talk about how people say, well, we're not quite there yet. And yet, again, I understand this president likes to brag a little bit, but certainly if you do the sort of apples to apples comparison about crude oil and about natural gas, we have done something that most people really wondered if we really ever could do. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple more of those, because then I've sort of been leaving for the next segment, these that were put together by John Nolte, the media's 9 worst fact checks of Trump's State of the Union. I've already sort of alluded to those, but I thought I'd go into them a little bit more detail, because if nothing else, if you go on our website, you'll see that a lot of these are Twitter posts, which, if nothing else, I hope just really alerts you to the fact that maybe it is wise that even if you see it written down, even if it's a Twitter tweet, even if it's a Facebook post, even if it's something that appears in an internet website, may not necessarily be the case, and it's worth checking out. And I think the most discouraging part about this is oftentimes we've been dependent upon fact checkers to really help us understand what is true about a speech and what is not. But I'm starting to perceive, and you'll certainly see this when we come back from the break, a lot more bias against certainly President Donald Trump, which is understandable because some of those doing fact checks, obviously, as you can tell from some of their other tweets, don't really like him. We'll come back and talk more about fact-checking the fact checkers right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Just spend a little bit of time talking about the need to always have discernment and trying to do a little bit of the fact-checking of the fact-checkers as well. One of the things I've suggested is that you might, especially if you have young people, consider something that they might benefit from. We've talked about before our Mind Games conference, and that's something that will be happening in the summer, this time in June. And it really gives them a week to really begin to develop a Christian world and life view. One of the things we talk about at the Mind Games conference and the Mind Games camps that we do is to really develop what I call your baloney baloney detector, because you see some things and you just go, that can't possibly be true, and to really begin to develop some discernment. So let me just mention that one of the things we make available here is the little booklet and brochure, and if you would like to get a copy and maybe have a young person to get ready for what they're going to encounter, either if they go into college or if they go out into the real world, the Mind Games conference taking place in June is just another place where we really encourage you to develop discernment. You might even want to bring one of those speakers into your church to do the same kind of thing and just help you get some discernment about some of these really important issues. But I thought I'd leave to the last here, before we get into some other issues, the media's 9 worst fact checks by John Nolte. This appeared in Breitbart, and he goes through this in some detail. Some we've sort of talked about, but let me go through them real quickly, 1 through 9. The first is the New York Times criticized the president for saying that we have an urgent national crisis because of what is happening at the border. And so they actually labeled that statement as false. Okay, if you read all the way down, and you have to go to a couple of paragraphs, and I love what John Nolte says, a paragraph of pedantic blah, 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 that eventually they admit, quote, a record number of families have tried to cross the border in recent months, overwhelming officials at the border and creating a new kind of humanitarian crisis. So if you only read the headlines or even the first line that simply says, actually, border crossings have been declining for the last 2 decades, which is true, you don't come to the statement that we have a record number of families that have been trying to cross the border in the last couple of months. I don't think you label that as false, but again, the New York Times labeled it as false. Number 2, the New York Times, we'll stay on them for another minute here, talked about the fact that when Donald Trump said that border apprehensions plummeted by 91% after fencing was completed in San Diego, they said that that was, quote, misleading. And their argument is that border apprehensions decreased by 91%. Okay, true. Right after the original fencing was completed, true. But according to the Congressional Research Service, the primary fence by itself did not have the impact that Donald Trump said that it did. How do you prove a negative, or how do you prove that it didn't? I mean, again, I can't imagine that the fence is responsible for all of the decline. But I don't think you could get away with saying that it wasn't responsible for any of the decline at all. If for no other reason, it may have been, if nothing else, responsible for those who decided not to even try to cross the border. So, again, there you have the New York Times. And if it isn't enough, let's go to the New York Times one more time here. And this one really causes me to roll my eyes, because Donald Trump said that we've been fighting in the Middle East for almost 19 years. When I read this one, I said, you have got to be kidding. They actually posted, it has been almost 18 years, because on October 7th, 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom, the American military and NATO mission to rid Afghanistan of al-Qaeda began. Really? Okay, President might have been wiser if he just said almost 19 or almost 18, whatever. The point he's making is it really doesn't make a bit of difference. To quibble about that, whether it's 18 or 19 years, again, is the kind of thing that we're running into, which brings me to number 4. Now, this comes from the Washington Post. You've already heard me talk about this, but it is just the most amazing thing, because the Washington Post fact-checked the fact that Trump says 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the long journey north, but there's less to that number that meets the eye, because guess what? It's not 33%, it's 31%. That's the kind of quibbling and nitpicking that we began to see. And number 5 is also in the same area. Politico, again, says that this claim that 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted is not true, because it is not 31%, it's not 33%, it is 31%. And so you can see the attempt to try to just keep labeling things as false, misleading, whatever. This drumbeat just continues on. Well, number 6, let's take a different one here. Donald Trump, you might remember, said we have more women serving in Congress than ever before. Now, that actually brought an applause from some of the women in white. And, of course, in this case, National Public Radio had to weigh in. Yes, there are more women in Congress than ever before, but they're not in Donald Trump's party. So this is at least misleading, if not false. The number of Republican women in the House has fallen from 23% to 13%. And, of course, the number in Congress itself have increased. But, again, you can certainly say that you even, let's just take the Senate, since a lot of us are more aware of those particular cases. Marsha Blackburn is a woman Republican in Tennessee. In Arizona, you've always had 2 men. Now you have 2 women, 1 Republican, 1 Democratic. Of course, 1 was elected, 1 was appointed. But first of all, he was just applauding the number of women. But even that, according to at least NPR and some of the others, was itself misleading, if not false. Okay, a couple more, because I'm wearing out. I'm sure you probably are as well. This one was interesting. Annie Carney said that Donald Trump just ad-libbed, "They came down from heaven." And a reason she says they ad-libbed is some of us that actually have the transcript of what the president's going to say. They issue that. First, CNN and a variety of others in the White House has that. There's some places where he will sort of ad-lib. And, of course, you might remember the Holocaust survivor was talking about watching these American soldiers liberate Dachau. And so he said, and so they felt like they came down from heaven. And Annie Carney said, well, that's not right, because Jews don't believe in heaven. I love that one. Okay. To her credit, she then said, okay, after I said this I think this was a tweet, if I remember right, she said, this was just sent to me by a reader. While it's true that the Hebrew Bible does not mention an afterlife, there is a complex eschatology that includes a very detailed map of Jewish afterlife contained in rabbinic, Kabbalistic, and Hasidic literature. So maybe if Donald Trump had said eschatology instead of heaven, it would have worked. But you can see, again, some of the nitpicking. And, okay, this one is a little bit more than nitpicking, because I think all of us cringed a little bit when Donald Trump said, if I had not been elected president of the United States, we would right now, in my opinion, be in a major war with North Korea. Okay, there's an eye roller one. I'll give him that one. Although some even challenged that one as well. And then one more. Washington Post also got into this issue about the abortion bill, and we haven't talked too much about that, although that was discussed quite a bit yesterday by Nick Pitts and Chelsea Human and others. But again, Donald Trump put it this way. Lawmakers in New York cheered with delight upon the passage of legislation that would allow a baby to be ripped from the mother's womb moments before birth. And, of course, that was a powerful statement indeed. But I think it illustrates, again, how political correctness has made it impossible to be a comedian anymore, because people are now taking everything too literally. And political correctness has made it impossible almost to use a little bit of hyperbole to drive your point home. But Washington Post said the legislation in New York would not have allowed a baby to be ripped from the mother's womb moments before birth. It states a healthcare practitioner may perform an abortion when, according to the practitioner's reasonable and good faith professional judgment based on the facts of the patient's case, the patient is within 24 weeks from the commencement of pregnancy, or is there an absence of fetal viability, or the abortion is necessary to protect the patient's life or health. So, first of all, that is not exactly all that the bill entails. But again, ripped from the mother's body, again, a little bit of a rhetorical flourish.
Not sure I would say that was misleading or false, because if you looked at it from the baby's point of view, that's exactly what's taking place. Anyway, I probably took a little bit longer on the media fact-checking than we needed to do, but I just wanted, if nothing else, to do something we do so often here on Point of View, and that is really just warn you to pay attention, to look things up. Even right now, if you said, I'd like to post some of these on my Facebook page or my Twitter account, we have both articles, the 13 fact checks on the State of the Union address. That comes from the Daily Signal. Jarrett Stepman put that one together. And then we just a minute ago mentioned the one by John Nolte, the media's 9 worst fact checks of Trump's State of the Union. They're available to you, and if you want to post them or use them to do a point-counterpoint, maybe with some of your friends, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C. in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me talk about the environment, and then the next hour we're going to be talking with Drew Dyck. Your future self will thank you. Secrets to self-control from the Bible and brain science. You know, one of the gifts of the Spirit, and really one of the fruits of the Spirit, probably be a better way to say it, is the idea of self-control. And so we certainly want to have self-control. I suspect now by February, some of you that had those New Year's resolutions in January
haven't been doing quite so well there, so we're going to spend some time talking with him. And then in the third hour, I might just mention Dave and Ann Wilson will be with us talking about their book, Vertical Marriage, and giving you some great marriage tips. So we'll get into some of that as well. But let's, if we can, talk about some of these environmental issues. And in particular, my commentary yesterday is on the Green New Deal. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and there's a place where you can actually go and see more viewpoints. The one today is on climate change alarmism, which I may get to, but we may not have enough time. And you can also, of course, sign up to receive those if you aren't already receiving them. And in there, I just pointed out the fact that the Green New Deal is, again, one of those focus group tested kind of phrases. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a New Deal. Of course, Lyndon Johnson had the Great Society, and this is the Green New Deal. But as I point out before, most of us are so busy, we don't have time to sit down and read all of it. And since they don't, I just gave you two key points yesterday. The first is the plan would cut military spending by at least half. And I go into the numbers about 1.3 million active duty troops, another 865,000 reserves, 680,000 civilian employees. We're talking about probably taking 1 million military personnel and putting them out of work. So that's the first issue. And that's in part because a lot of the greenies in this case are sort of anti-military, but they also need the money to pay for some of this. And then the other issue that I mentioned just a minute ago is the eventual, and I use the word eventual in quotes because they'd like to do it in 10 years, the eventual elimination of all fossil fuels and even nuclear power, which, by the way, is not a carbon-emitting technology. But nevertheless, natural gas produces 32% of our energy, oil and liquid natural gas another 28%, coal 18%, nuclear produces 10%. You add all that up, and, you know, we're supposed to replace 88% of America's current energy sources. But the bigger issue, as I point out, is just the amount of draconian regulations necessary. Because this isn't going to happen just, you know, because people wave a wand or because we have a campaign. You have to empower the government to force people to do things they probably wouldn't want to do. And I point out that if you've ever read anything about that, or Jonah Goldberg has a good piece about how in some cases we actually militarized the workforce during the 1930s, did some things which, frankly, I think were unconstitutional, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt that's what he had to do to deal with the Great Depression. And so as a result, you lose a lot of your liberty. Well, it so happens that indeed what we have is a presentation that was given by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who we've talked about on this program before. Michael Pulitz has actually put together a summary, but he has a link. You can probably follow the link, and there's 6 pages, and you can kind of just look at the notes that she was speaking from. But let's just talk about just a few other issues that involve what's called the Green New Deal. First of all, to rebuild every single building in the United States. It's just mind-blowing. The actual quote is upgrade or replace every building in the United States for state-of-the-art energy efficiency. Okay, so again, you have that draconian claim that needs to happen. Then, of course, what about the traditional forms of energy? The Green New Deal is, quote, a 10-year plan to mobilize every aspect of American society on a scale not seen since World War II to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Then, as I mentioned, nuclear power itself does not emit carbon dioxide. And by the way, if you're not familiar, and maybe I'll do this in a future program here, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is lower than it's been in most of Earth's history. Matter of fact, many times it was much higher. There's a concern that if the carbon dioxide percentage went down too far, plants would not efficiently produce photosynthesis. And since plants are at the very base of our food pyramid, that's not a good thing either. But nevertheless, gets back to this. Nuclear energy itself would be banned. Again, the question that is being raised or used in this presentation on the Green New Deal, again, quote, it's unclear if we will be able to decommission every nuclear plant within 10 years, but the plan is to transition off of nuclear and all fossil fuels as soon as possible. Okay, maybe you like to fly on an airplane. Well, that changes a little bit here because the plan is to build out high-speed rail at a scale where air travel stops becoming necessary. So the goal is let's just have high-speed rail so we won't actually have to fly on airplanes anymore. and we'll just simply get rid of those airplanes, except for the few places and times where that's really important. Then the idea of carbon capture and storage. We believe the right way to capture carbon is to plant trees and restore our natural ecosystems, and some of those things being made. Then one of the other points, which I should have made in my commentary, is to mandate that all new jobs be unionized. Here's the quote: ensure that all the GND jobs are union jobs that will pay prevailing wages and hire local individuals. Then the idea of a carbon tax. Again, this is a direct quote. We're not ruling out a carbon tax, but a carbon tax would be a tiny part of the Green New Deal. So maybe we will, maybe we won't. And then it also may include the idea of cap and trade. Cap and trade will be a tiny part of the larger Green New Deal. That's where, again, you cap certain things in certain industries, and then if another industry has more efficiency, you can trade some of your carbon credits and things like that. And, of course, by now you're saying, how much is this going to cost? Well, again, no estimate was offered in the presentation, but again, let me quote from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who says that even if every billionaire and company came together and were willing to pour all the resources at their disposal into this investment, the aggregate value of the investments they could make would not be sufficient. So the implication is, even if we come up with these draconian taxes on wealthy people, and by the way, if you then raise their taxes to 70% or 90%, do you think they're going to keep doing what they're doing right now? Of course, that's another whole issue. But again, the question, she says, isn't how we pay for it, but what will we do with our new shared prosperity? And that may kind of puzzle you. Prosperity? Well, again, if you understand kind of the socialist argument, you need to go back to Karl Marx. Karl Marx argued that the reason we have the problems we have today is due to capitalism. He would admit that capitalism was better than feudalism, better than mercantilism, but eventually capitalism would give way to socialism. Because as you begin to change the economic base, then you change the cultural superstructure and you change people from the outside in. In other words, you can create the new Marxist man. And as a result, now this will cause people to be much more efficient, much more generous, so each will produce according to their ability, and then each will receive according to their needs. And so we will no longer have problems with greed because we'll create people in this new Marxist image. And so all we have to do then is figure out how we share this abundant prosperity. If that doesn't sound like a lot of common sense, I think you've now gotten at least a little bit of the understanding of why socialism and Marxism haven't been effective. We as Christians recognize that human behavior is fixed. People are greedy. Even if they are altruistic people, they still look out for their own self-interest, and sometimes they can be selfish. There is human sin nature, and that's not going to change when you change the economic foundations upon which we rest. But here is this optimistic idea that our biggest issue in the future will be how to share all the prosperity that comes from this new Green New Deal. Anyway, just thought I'd give you a brief overview. If you'd like to read a little bit more about that, you can find that on the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to talk about self-control right after these important messages.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Make your next bold move now. Give online at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. It's our future. The time is now. Pointofview.net. and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and it does seem to me that we all struggle with that in one way or another. We sometimes can't stop from eating too much. Maybe we are procrastinators and waste a lot of time online, or just simply cannot meet a deadline. Of course, I can ask how your various New Year's resolutions are coming, and maybe even falling for various kinds of temptations or other things in your life. So I thought it would be really appropriate about now to hear from Drew Dyck. He has been on the program with us before. He's the editor at Moody Publishers, and of course has in the past been the managing editor of Leadership Journal. He is the author of a couple of books we've talked about on this program, Generation X Christian and Yawning at Tigers, to mention a few. We have a lot of information about him and about this new book, Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science. A lot of just great endorsements that are in the book, and it's published by our friends at Moody Publishers, and you can look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have information for you to order it right here at pointofview.net. Drew, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you. That's right. I've been on before, and it's awesome to be back.
Well, and again, I would love to have you share your own story. If somebody had told me that you wrote this book, I thought, well, it's probably more just kind of looking at this vicariously, because he is an individual that has had to meet a lot of deadlines and had to force other writers to meet deadlines. So self-control is probably something he's got basically in his back pocket. Then I read the book and I go, maybe not. Tell us more.
Well, I'm glad that I had you fooled, at least for a while.
Yes.
Yeah, I wish I could say I was drawn to this topic out of pure academic interest, but the truth is, actually, initially I wasn't even writing a book. I was just researching because I was frustrated by my own inability, I should say, to control myself, whether it was, in what I ate or how often I exercised in those areas. So, yeah, this is something that's been a challenge for me, honestly. And so I started researching it, both from the scientific and the spiritual perspective, and was finding some things that were helpful. And then I thought, you know what, maybe this is a book. Maybe this could be helpful to others as well, and that's my hope.
And I might just mention that, again, we can very easily talk about some of the physical ones, exercising and losing weight and eating right, but also, praying and reading the Bible, being involved in church activities. So we're looking at this in a broader way than just, okay, we all need to go on a diet tomorrow and join a gym. There are all sorts of different ways, and actually in some ways where we might have good self-control, and other places where it's out of control. So in some respects, you're really trying to address this in the broadest way possible, aren't you?
That's right. I'm glad that you said that, because it's not just about the kind of little annoying habits, as important as it is to try to shed those. But it also affects your spiritual life, right? If you don't have self-control, you're probably not going to be very good about reading your Bible consistently or praying regularly. And it takes self-control to do those things, even though ultimately they're very enriching and rewarding. And so I just see this as such a huge topic. I think a lot of people have a lot of knowledge about God, and we need that. But often when we fail to make progress, I know at least in my experience, when we fail to make progress in our spiritual life, we're often just held back by a lack of self-control. and we really need to grow in this area.
Before we get into some of the specifics, let's talk about this idea of finding the foundation. I found that kind of intriguing because, again, one of these quotes, having first laid down self-control as a foundation for the soul, they build the other virtues on it. I had never really kind of thought about it in that way. And so from a philosophical point of view, we can see that self-control is really one of those foundational issues that affects the rest of your life.
It really does. And that was a new thing for me too. But I realized how true it was, because if you think about it, if you don't have self-control, can you be faithful to your spouse? No. Can you be generous with other people? Probably not, because you're going to blow all the money that you have on yourself. Can you be kind, honest? All these things take self-control. Some researchers call it an instrumental virtue, because it enables you to acquire other virtues and make progress in other areas of your life. So I just see this as a huge issue, obviously. And the good news is that people really can grow in self-control as we walk closely with God and we exert a little effort into living a godly life and controlling our actions. You can grow in this area. So that's the hopeful thing.
And again, we're going to be looking at it from a scriptural point of view and fighting the flesh and the devil and those kinds of things. We're going to look at it from a, if you will, brain research point of view and healthy habits and all the rest. But just before we take a break, I thought for just a minute we might camp out on the first chapter, because you talk about the benefits. We've already talked about self-control as a foundational issue, but also self-control can lead to what you call freedom and flourishing. So there is a reason to pay attention to this. Some people listening right now, Drew, I am sure, saying, well, that's just the way I am. That's the way my dad was. That's the way my mom was. You know, I'm always late. We never get things done. The house is always going to be a mess. I'm always going to be a procrastinator. In some respects, we need to come back and say there's some real benefits that sometimes we forget about if we actually are able to exercise self-control.
Yeah. You know, when I mentioned the topic of this book to friends and family, I'd hear a lot of sighs and groans.
Oh, yes.
You know, people going, oh, yeah, I need to do better about that.
Yeah. I need to buy that book. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The problem is sometimes we view this topic as kind of boring and confining, or, you know, in the broader culture, I think it's probably seen as repressive and Victorian or something. But the irony, I think, is that if you can cultivate self-control in your life, it leads, like you said, to a life of freedom and flourishing. You know, if you go crazy spending today, say on your credit card, well, that's going to feel pretty good in the short term, but down the road, it's going to confine your life. It's going to burden you with debt. That's just one example, but I think that's in every area of our life. If we become disciplined in the short term, in the long term, we find that our life opens up in new and exciting ways, and we can glorify God and love others because of it.
Again, we have a link to your website, and that's a place where people can find the book. And, of course, it has been released now. People may be able to find it in the local bookstore. But, again, if you are familiar with some of the other books that we've talked about with Drew, those are certainly ones that have been certainly helpful to some of you in terms of Generation Ex-Christian and Yawning at Tigers, so that you can't tame God, so stop trying. And this one, Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science. Lee Strobel's been in studio with us and on the phone with us many times before, says, few books have the potential to change your life as much as this one. I found it personally encouraging and challenging at the same time, a profound and practical reservoir of wisdom. Don't just read it, highlight it, underline it, and most of all, implement its teachings in your life. Transformation awaits. And there's one of the many actual comments and accolades about this particular book. So we're going to take a break and continue talking about this. We'll get into, of course, some of the issues of self-control, what the Bible has to say about self-control, about, if you will, your willpower muscles, as well as a variety of other issues. Frank, we can also learn a little bit about addicts and what they can teach us. So this covers a lot of topics, and it is, again, available in your local bookstore, or we have information about it online. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Turn on a television or open up a newspaper and you will be treated to what best can be called climate change alarmism. We're told that we are headed for a climate catastrophe if we don't act immediately. Of course, we've heard that before. Back in 1970, Harvard biologist George Wald predicted civilization will end within 15 to 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. A few years later, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich predicted that 1 billion people would be starving to death by 2020. Climate change alarmism today succeeds first in discounting any critics and then by warning that dire consequences are just a few years off. Meteorologist Dr. Roy Spencer recently wrote about this first issue. He says climate change advocates claim that anyone who disagrees with them is a climate change denier. He says this is a straw man argument where you argue against something your opponent never claims. Spencer says he cannot think of a single credentialed, published skeptical climate scientist who doesn't believe in the existence of climate change. This includes Dr. Patrick Michaels, Dr. Richard Lenzin, and others who have been labeled climate change deniers. And the last 2 decades have been full of dire warnings. In his Oscar-winning documentary, Al Gore warned that sea levels would rise by 20 feet in the near future. So far, his prediction has been off by 20 feet or so. A 2005 conference of climate scientists and politicians meeting in London warned that the world has as little as 10 years before it would reach the point of no return on global warming. Alarmists and doomsayers have been with us for decades, warning of an environmental catastrophe that still hasn't happened. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Self-control, our topic today, and the book is entitled Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science. Drew Dyck with us, and I might just mention as you go through each one of the chapters, you also have a self-control training. So this, Drew, is just another way to begin to say, okay, I see what you said, now how do I apply it? And all the way through the book, you have these self-control training sort of breakouts to give us some ideas and maybe even some suggestions on how to take these ideas and apply them to your day-to-day life.
That's right. And as I went and researched, I was also applying these ideas to the laboratory of my life. And so that was fun, and I'm pretty honest, I think, in the book about exactly how that went. There was some, sometimes where I would take 2 steps back and 1 step forward, but did make some progress. And so that was a fun part of writing this.
What is the relationship, if you will, between self-control and virtue? Because early on in one of the chapters, you talk about virtue formation, which, again, sounds like something from the 19th century that went out with buggy whips and everything else. But this idea of virtue formation was about honoring God and benefiting the community. It, if nothing else, reminds us that we as believers certainly should be exercising self-control, 1, because it's a fruit of the Spirit, but 2, because it's all part of this idea of virtue, isn't it?
It is. And one thing that I lament is that, historically, the church was where people learned the virtues and built them into their lives. And these days, you're probably more likely to, consult a success guru or a life coach or a psychologist if you want to develop certain traits in your life. But really, that historically has been the job of the church. And I think that's something that we need to get back. Sometimes I think we get a little fearful when people talk about virtues, because you go, okay, just a minute, is this going to be legalism? Are we going to be piling on rules? And that's a legitimate concern. But when we're talking about virtue in the scriptural sense of the fruit of the Spirit, and all the things that God wants us to exhibit in our lives, there's nothing legalistic about that. And I think that's something that we need to throw ourselves into.
Well, again, let's, if we can, talk about some of the scriptural principles. And in case you think, well, some of these great saints got it all tied down, Romans chapter 7, Apostle Paul says, I do not understand what I do, for I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. So the Apostle Paul 2,000 years ago talked about the struggle that he faces in terms of the fact that even though we're saved, we're still in the world, we still have the flesh, and of course we also have the temptation from the devil. Take us through some of those passages that you actually spent some time kind of looking through.
Yes, that's a big one. And when you read Romans 7, it's like, man, Paul, it sounds like you're reading my diary, because that's the struggle that so many of us have. It's like, you know what you should do, you know what Scripture tells you to do and how you should live, but then you get into these situations where you find yourself defaulting to bad habits and sinful behaviors. And so, like they say, the struggle is real. And fortunately, though, God doesn't leave us on our own to battle this either. That's another thing that I think is an important part of this topic. After all, it's a fruit of the Spirit, right? And that Paul is using a metaphor there, saying in the same way that a plant or a tree has to be connected to the soil in order to grow fruit, we have to be connected to God to see these virtues, including self-control, be cultivated in our life. So I think that's a really big part of this issue. And I think to use the $10 theological word, sanctification,
yes,
lifelong process of becoming more and more like Jesus, it doesn't happen overnight, right? It is sort of a lifelong struggle, and self-control is a big part of that. I think some people have this idea that, man, I'm a believer. God's adopted me. Amen. I shouldn't struggle anymore. I should be able to kind of sit back and take a pleasure cruise towards holiness. But that's not how the Scriptures portray the Christian life. We're commanded to resist sin, to resist the devil, to strive for godliness, to run the race, all these great metaphors that imply a purposeful, intense struggle. And I just want to encourage people, sometimes when you're stuck spiritually, maybe it's because you're not striving in that biblical sense hard enough. And you do need to exert some self-control, of course, drawing on the power of the Holy Spirit. And you can, by God's grace, make progress.
Well, and again, one of the other concerns is that sometimes people don't have a proper view of human nature. And Drew, I've run into people all the time that say, well, I'm a Christian. I believe all men are basically good. All people are basically good. And now I'm going to say, well, just go to page 62 of Drew's book here, in which you got the list here. The Bible states our hearts are deceitful, desperately wicked. And you say, well, what did Jesus have to say? Well, he talked about evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander, all sorts of what we might call destructive impulses. And so sometimes, even though we're Christians, we kind of forget our sin nature and forget that in some cases it is easy to be affected by the world, the flesh, or the devil. It is very easy to be affected by various temptations. And so we shouldn't be surprised that it is a battle, because that's what the Scripture calls it, right?
Right. And that's the first thing to get straight, I think, when it comes to this issue, is that you are fallen, that you have a sinful nature. If you don't concede that fact right off the bat, you are going to be helpless against the temptations that come along. And I think it's dangerous, because the broader culture would have you believe that the real problem is that you just haven't dug deep down enough into.
And again, we'll see if we can get him back on in just a minute, but we're talking about, again, this very important book, Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible. And I thought I might mention in that chapter also, we have Barna Research that actually conducted more than 1,000 interviews with Americans, different ages, different backgrounds, things like that. And the purpose of the study was to kind of discover our biggest temptations and, of course, how we deal with them. Now, here's the list. When we ask people about those temptations, procrastinating, 60%, worrying, 60%, eating too much, 55%, spending too much time on media, 44%. Those were kind of those common temptations. Then when you get into some of the more serious ones, viewing pornography, lying or cheating, abusing drugs and alcohol, doing something sexually inappropriate, we're also there in different numbers, some in the single digits, others in the double digits. But again, it illustrates that this is kind of a bigger problem than we might acknowledge. And so in some respects, that is certainly key. And when we come back, we'll also just talk about the fact that in some cases, we recognize that temptation is not sin. Matter of fact, Dave Kinnaman, who has been on the program with us before, president of Barna, observed that only 1% of Americans of any age were able to articulate that giving into sin might be, giving into temptation, I should say, might be caused by sin. Most Americans think of temptation merely as a steady stream of highs and lows that must be navigated. And this reveals a gap, he says, in biblical thought on the subject of temptation among the nation's population. So in some respects, as we were talking about just a minute ago, we don't necessarily always have a biblical view of human nature, but we also sometimes don't have a biblical view of temptation as well. And so, again, we have Drew back with us as well. And while you were off, we spent just a little bit of time talking about the Barna research that showed procrastinating, worrying, eating too much, spending too much time on media, as well as other things that would be more concerning, pornography, lying, cheating, abusing drugs, and all the rest, show up. But I think the bigger issue is my quote from Dave Kinnaman: only 1% were able to articulate that giving into temptation might be caused by sin. So if you don't have a proper view of human nature, and then you don't have a proper view of temptation and sin, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, aren't you, Drew?
Absolutely. That's the problem. You're like a blind boxer. You're getting hit, but you don't know where the blows are coming from if you don't understand your own fallen nature. But when you do, it's actually a good news scenario, because then that arms you with a sober self-awareness, right? And then you can be wise in taking certain precautions to avoid temptation. You're more humble, so you realize that you need to rely upon God to help you in this battle. And as Christians, of course, we know that we're fallen and that our hearts are evil, and we need to grapple with that reality.
Well, let's take a break. And one of the things he says is that a failure to control yourself always a sin. And I love this. Eating a cookie instead of kale isn't evil. It just means your taste buds are working properly. So glad to hear that. So we're going to take a break. We got a lot more to cover here. Secrets to self-control from the Bible and brain science. So far, we've talked about some of the biblical ideas. But it is interesting. We're learning things about brain science. We're learning some things about the way we are constructed, the way we react to stimuli. So we're going to get into that as well. Fascinating book, published by our friends at Moody Publishers, and it is on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Drew Dyck, as we're talking about his book, Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science. Might just mention, Drew, that we have a link to your website. Let's talk about what's available there, because they can find out more about you, find out more about your books, some of the articles and interviews, your speaking opportunities, the blog. There's just a great series of various articles and resources available to our listeners as they go to your website.
And if there are a couple excerpts of the book as well, if they're interested. And there are some slightly corny pictures of me with my family. So there's that, too.
Yes. You know, I get to Oregon every every fall. I've got to swing by and see you sometime up there. But if nothing else, we certainly want to get back to the book, because a lot of people said, okay, I kind of know what the scriptures have to say, but I got some other questions about this, and that is, what have we learned in terms of brain science? And one of the things you talk about is hope for growth, how to grow your puny willpower muscles. And we're starting to learn a little bit more about the way our brains work, the way we react to stimulus. And in some respects, to me, some of these brain research findings just validate what we find in Scripture. But tell us what you found as you started researching this.
Yeah. That's exactly what I found. I was always struck by when I'd read a study and realize that it complements what we already find in Scripture. One of those findings that was a big aha moment for me early on was reading about willpower. And willpower is simply the emotional energy that you need to exert self-control.
Yes.
So about 20 years ago, researchers found out something fascinating about willpower, and it's simply this, that it's finite, that it runs out, that you don't have a limitless supply of it. And so study after study, they test people, and sure enough, they get weaker as they have to either concentrate on a difficult task or avoid or resist temptation. And so, yeah, as a Christian, that wasn't a big surprise for me to find out that we're fallible, finite creatures. We know that pretty well. I think of Jesus' words to his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion, where he said, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. And I think it makes a lot of sense, too, out of biblical commands like flee temptation rather than stand and fight it, because we might think that we can resist something forever, but we get weaker as we go. So the big takeaway for me there was be aware of that you have this limited reserve of willpower. And often it made sense of the experience of my own life. If I have a difficult day at work, you're expending a lot of willpower, and then you come home and maybe you're shorter with your kids. And some of that, not to excuse it, is just the fact that your willpower is depleted. And then you go into a situation, especially if it's stressful, you are going to behave in a way that you don't want to. So you definitely want to preserve and make sure that you're replenished.
One of the examples you use is from Dr. Bradley Wright. I've read some of his material, University of Connecticut, sociologist, and I love one of his lines here is, if I wanted to destroy your self-control, this is how I do it. First, I'd make sure that you only got 3 hours of sleep. Then I'd see to it that you got in a fight with your wife. And it gets back to this idea of depletion again, and maybe also explains why sometimes we just fall apart, because you can even see that with Elijah in the Old Testament. He's had this high-octane confrontation, Ahab, Jezebel, the prophets of Baal, all of this. And then eventually there's just nothing left, as you can tell. And he's depressed, and of course he needs to be fed, he needs to get rest, and in some respects that's another aspect of what we're learning about in terms of willpower, isn't it?
Right, that's a great example. You're right. You'd think that he'd be on this incredible high and feel great after defeating the prophets of Baal, but instead he goes and cries in a cave. And I think that's a lot of what's going on there.
Not the image you expect.
And I think, yeah, it isn't. And I think we see that in our own life. Even when things are going well, if we've had to exert a lot of willpower, often after we're very vulnerable to sin. And so it's crucial to be aware of that. Now, the good news, and when I spoke to Dr. Bradley Wright, the metaphor he used is that willpower is like a muscle. It gets tired quickly, but as you use it more and more, it will grow.
It's better, yes.
That's the good news. Yeah.
Something else that was, I think, insightful is the idea of making self-control automatic, the transforming power of habits. And we recognize how important habits are. If you do something for, and we always have a debate, is it 20 days or 30 days? But whenever it's a couple of weeks, you have created a new habit. I ask you how you brush your teeth. You go, I have to think about it, just doing it so automatically. I ask you which route you take when you go to your office. And so, well, the car almost drives itself. There is a sense in which those habits, which help us in the physical world, will also help us in the area of self-control in the emotional world. True?
Yeah, that's right. And this goes back to the willpower conversation, because you've got this limited willpower. The best way to use that willpower is to initiate new habits. And you're right, habits are just those unconscious patterns that we have in our lives that we default to. We like to think that we go through our life making careful decisions at every turn, but often we just default to our habits. And that can be a good thing if it's a healthy habit, or a bad thing. So an example, that I found in my own life, I had a bad habit. I realized every morning when I'd wake up, I'd roll out of bed, and there was my iPhone sitting on my nightstand, and I'd pick it up, and immediately I'd go to social media, start checking social media. Not that that's a terrible thing, but the way I wanted to start my day was by reading Scripture. And no matter how many times I told myself, first thing in the morning, I'm going to read a chapter or two from the Bible, instead, I would grab my phone because there was this habit. Mm-hmm. So what I eventually had to do is put my phone in a different part of the room, plunk down my big black Bible on my nightstand, and then I was conditioned, though, when I rolled out of bed to grab something and start reading. And instead, now it was reading the Bible. So it's a simple little trick, but it's yielded amazing benefits in my life. I rarely miss my morning reading of Scripture now because of that.
My phone is on the farthest part of my house. Our bedroom's in one corner, and my little office that I use at home is on the other, and it gets charged up there. And, of course, then nobody ever wakes me up. And back to the habits, you have a whole section on Billy Graham's spiritual habits, holy habits, and it kind of, I guess, leads into the chapter on training your elephant, building healthy habits into your life. I guess, first of all, you need to explain the elephant, but more importantly, I think it just illustrates, again, what you're trying to actually do in your life.
Yeah, so that elephant image is a way of talking about habits. It's like the image of a rider with an elephant. The rider is your conscious mind, right, that makes decisions, but the elephant is the habit, and often that's what really does most of the work of your life. And so what I was talking about there is being intentional about training your habits. Just really quickly, a habit, when you break it down, has three parts. It has a cue, that's what triggers a behavior to start. It has a routine, which is the actual behavior. And then it has a reward, something that is a payoff for you and that helps cement the habit into place. So the key in creating a new habit, first of all, you want to replace old bad habits with new good ones. And then you do a little bit of a surgery on that habit loop. So you might want to keep the cue the same. With the example that I did of reading my Bible every morning instead of looking on my phone, right. The cue was to roll out of bed and look at something on my nightstand. I changed the routine, and then the reward is different. Maybe from looking online, I get some affirmation because someone liked a comment I said, and now it's getting to spend some time with God and being refreshed in my soul. And so it really helps to understand how habits work and how pervasive they are in our lives, so that we can take a hard look at that and go, I need to change these.
Yes. And again, some of those ideas of a habit being like an elephant that comes from Jonathan Haidt. He's just on the program with us recently as we talked about his book on the coddling of the American mind. So you can read more about that. But again, that habit loop is something to think about because you have a routine, you have a reward, you have a cue, and to recognize that sometimes you have some kind of craving that drives that. And so whether it's food, whether it's a desire to look at pornography, whether it's just to look at your social media, whether it's the idea that, sure, I do want to exercise, but I just haven't created a habit to do that. I mean, I've heard people even talk about putting their exercise clothes on the bed so they get up and go, okay, better put these on right now and get into that. So they're just all sorts of very positive ways to do that. But again, the diagram, which again, if it was television, we put up right now, the habit loop, I think is very helpful to understand that it's kind of three stages. And as you begin to understand your loop, whether you're dealing with a new diet, whether you're dealing with the idea of fitness, whether you're trying to maybe make a covenant with your eyes about what you're going to see, those are some really important habit ideas that are in the book.
And so let's take a break. We have a couple more chapters to get into. And even if we cover all the chapters, we haven't covered them in depth. So again, let me encourage you to consider getting a copy of the book, Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science, a guide to sinners, quitters, and procrastinators. And I think we can learn some things as well from people that are addicts. And so what can they teach us about self-control? And, of course, we also want to apply the biblical concept of grace. So we have a few more things to talk about, and we will do that with Drew Dyck. And if you would like to join with us, of course, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We have a website as well, drewdyck.com. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C. in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Drew Dyck with us for a few more minutes as we talk about self-control. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Massachusetts, WSEW. Pamela, you're on with Drew.
Hi. I had a question regarding in the information that might be in the book, pointing to the fact that the way things really seem to stick with people with regards to changing habits or creating new habits is support from other people, because that's like the top number one thing that you've got to get with somebody or a group or some other way to have that support system, support network going. I've done a lot of wellness lectures and workshops, and we've stated that all the time. It really is the support from other people. So is there something in the book that mentions this? Or
Sounds like chapter 9 to me. Drew, what about it?
Yeah, no, Pamela, thank you so much for raising that, because that's a huge part of this. When it comes to self-control or forming new habits, lone rangers or dead rangers, you have to seek out a group that, preferably a group of folks who understand whatever struggle you're going through, whatever behavior you want to change, and are trying to do the same thing, and get inspiration and encouragement and accountability. That's why church is so important. That's why, the last chapter of the book, Kerby, that you referenced, is all about what we can learn from addicts. And you look at people that do the Alcoholics Anonymous program, for instance, and the support network is crucial. You don't, get over alcoholism by saying, I'm going to tough this out on my own. No, and regardless, you can be clean and sober for 20 years, and still every week you're meeting in a basement somewhere and pulling out a metal chair and saying, "Hi, my name's Bob, and I'm an alcoholic," right? Because you need that support group. So I'm so glad you raised that. Absolutely. If you're trying to change your behaviors, get some help from some like-minded friends that are going to encourage you along the way.
Pamela, thank you so much for what apparently is your work as well, and I appreciate you calling in today.
Thanks.
Let's, if I can, just real quickly, again, that is the chapter we were going to get to about what addicts can teach us, and there's some really great material there, but I thought I'd get to one others, and that is disciplined living in an age of distraction. It's been my theory that in some respects it is more difficult to live the Christian life even now than in some times, because you think about the willpower issue, or we even talked about Elijah. Sometimes there would be these major confrontations that a prophet in the Old Testament or Jesus in the New Testament have, but then it says, and then they traveled on to Galilee. And so there would be a time to decompress. There'd be a time to stop, eat some bread, some fish, or whatever. Now we can go from one high-octane activity to another high-octane activity, and that can wear us down. But the other is now we're just sort of online 24/7 if we're one of those people. Obviously, you and I are not, but one of those people that keeps a phone by your bed. And so in some respects, with all of these distractions, self-control is even more difficult, isn't it?
It is. And yeah, in every era, Christians have had to resist their flesh and the devil. But I do think that new media, the ubiquity of technology that we have access to, presents a unique challenge in our time. And it does so in a couple of ways. First of all, it makes a lot of temptations more readily available, right? If you want to look at pornography online, I mean, it's at your fingertips, literally. If you, if you're addicted to shopping, well, guess what? The internet makes that easier too. Or gambling, you name it. So it kind of shoves temptation right into our face. And then the second way, and you've alluded to this, is the way that it subtly changes the way that we think, right? Our attention spans shrink. We're addicted to stimulus and novelty. And when you look at your phone, I mean, the average American looks at their phone 150 times a day. We're on screens for 37, 38 hours a week. And that has a sort of negative impact at the neurological level that makes things like prayer and Bible reading and other spiritual disciplines very difficult. So what I advise in the book, man, you got to set some kind of bright line strategies, these rules that kind of you go, hey, no screen time for our family on such and such a day, or I'm going to leave the phone downstairs when I go up to sleep at night. You have to establish some boundaries to avoid technology from just inundating your life.
Well, and again, the addiction issue, you talk about the dopamine-driven feedback loops that are, of course, affecting all in society. And as important as the internet may be as a source, I also love that in that chapter you have what you call the wisdom pyramid, which I think is wonderful, because at the very bottom of this triangle is the Bible, our daily bread, then the local church and tradition, then things like nature and beauty, working your way up to the top, books, young people, there's still things called books out there, the internet, and finally at the very top, social media. And when you look at that, you realize that some of these things have been around for millennia. They're time-tested. They're the way to develop wisdom. And others are just a flash in the pan, Here today, gone tomorrow. And it's just a reminder that you really want to feast your mind and your eyes on those things that are going to be, of course, as it talks about in Philippians 4:8, those things that are going to be really helpful to you in your Christian life.
Yeah, and that's kind of the chart was something that my friend Brett McCracken put together, and he was riffing on Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. But I think it's great because, the base, the thing that's going to keep you solid is the Word of God and the community with other believers. And if you tip that pyramid and you put, like a lot of people do, and you put time online, social media as kind of your mainstay, that's going to have a really negative effect on your spiritual life.
Let me just mention that as we've gone through this, I would imagine if I didn't have this book in my hand, I'd say I'm going to get that book as soon as we're finished here. Fortunately, I'm holding it in my hand right now. But if people wanted to get this book or your earlier books, Generation X Christian or Yawning at Tigers, You Can't Tame God, So Stop Trying, if they would like to maybe have you come and speak, if they'd like to see some of your articles, your interviews, or follow you on the blog, we have certainly made that available and also made it possible, as we've been showing online and on our screens here, links to your Facebook page and Twitter accounts and all the rest. So there's just a lot of ways people can connect with you. But one last time, just before I let you go, talk about what people will actually find when they land on your website.
Yeah, so they can find, I got a blog there that I don't blog as much as I should probably, but there's some excerpts from the book and some interviews that I've done, and they can find out a little more about me if they want to connect with me online. I do spend probably too much time on Twitter, so if you're on there, check me out. And if you happen to be in the lovely, beautiful green Northwest, I'm 15 minutes from downtown Portland, so look me up and we'll grab a coffee.
Well, every year I'm down there at Cannon Beach because I teach at Ecola, and of course my wife is from Oregon. I was married in Oregon, so certainly a great opportunity to maybe see you in the future. So look forward to that. And so, Drew, thank you for joining us. I've appreciated all of your books, and this one is certainly going to be helpful to all of our listeners. So again, you can find that at our website, pointofview.net, and all the other connections you need to make. So, Drew, thanks for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to change topics, as you might imagine. Going to talk about the subject of marriage, vertical marriage. I'll explain more about that in just a little bit. But as we're going to the break, a couple of quick questions and comments. First of all, my commentary today is on climate change alarmism. And the one yesterday was on the Green New Deal. And I did spend some time an hour ago talking about that on, so you might want to see some of that or find that article. But also, don't forget, we do have a trip to Israel taking place this fall in October, and we're starting to fill up that first bus, and we only have 2. So if you want to join us, I would encourage you to go to the website, click on the button that says Go to Israel with Kerby, and then if you're interested, put down the deposit. Want to make sure we have a space for you. We come back, we'll talk about vertical marriage, the one secret that will change your marriage. We'll be right back.
Question, do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare, and they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This topic this hour is going to be the subject of marriage, and we're going to be talking about this new book, which is called Vertical Marriage. It is the one secret that will change your marriage, and the authors join us by phone. Dave and Ann Wilson are also the co-founders, and of course, the teaching pastors at Kensington Community Church. If you are familiar with that name, it might be because you've maybe been to one of the Family Life Weekend to Remember, where they've had a chance to speak. Of course, their church hosts about 14,000 attendees in multiple campuses. They live in the area of Detroit, Michigan, and join us now by phone. So, Dave and Ann, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
We're glad to be here from cold Michigan.
I'm sure it is cold up there.
Yeah, it is.
You know, one of the things, Dave and Ann, that I think people would think is, okay, well, they teach at Family Life, a Weekend to Remember. They must have a perfect marriage because they were the co-founders of this church. This must be just sharing all the successes out of their life. You opened the book with a gut punch, if I can call it that, and that is about 10 years ago. Well, on the 10th anniversary, I guess I should say, you were in very different places. So, Dave, I'll let you tell your story, and then I want to hear yours as well, because you obviously were not at the same place spiritually or even in terms of your marriage, were you?
No, I mean, as you read through the book, you find out that your marriage is probably a lot better than ours.
At least was.
In fact, the first person that read our manuscript, that's what she said. She goes, wow, our marriage is a lot better than yours. But we've never been a couple that tries to pretend like we have the perfect marriage. But I actually, as you read, when we opened the book at the 10-year anniversary, I sort of did think our marriage was really good. I say if you would ask me before that date, on our 10th anniversary, what our marriage was, I would have said it's a 10 on a scale of 10, 1 out of 10.
Which is crazy, because I would have said that we're a 1, probably closer to a 0.5, and the fact that Dave thought we were doing so well, that was even more irritating to me, because I just felt like he wasn't interested or invested in us, and so we were not at a good place in my eyes.
And I think the point that probably would get anybody as they're reading through this, especially, I think this would hit a man more than a woman. You go to kiss your wife and she won't let you kiss her. It's like, okay, what is going on here? And then the usual, oh, nothing's wrong kind of reaction. Yeah. So play that a little bit longer, because I think there is something that's really powerful, and it really is a great story about her eventually saying, I've lost my feelings for you. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked because it was the date of all dates. I mean, I had 10 roses delivered to the table, one at a time, which, I looked at the waiter and he brought the first rose over and we talked about year one and then the second rose and so on. So we did everything you should do to romance a woman. We talked over a nice meal that cost a lot of money in a nice restaurant. And so it was, in my opinion, just a great night. I was even giving the waiter tips on how to woo a woman, It was like, this couldn't be better. So then we're driving home, and I had one more surprise for Ann, and that was to pull in the parking lot of this middle school parking lot. It was about midnight where we were about to start our church. We hadn't launched it yet. We just signed a contract so I thought it'd be pretty cool to just pray about what God would do through this church and then go parking, which is... Maybe you have to Google that these days, but you know what I mean. So
yes.
And I thought for sure this would end well. And like you said, I went to kiss her, and she turned her head. And so I finally did ask, is anything wrong? First she said no, and then I asked again, and then she said 6 words that changed my life, changed our life.
And I felt so bad, too, because I knew that he had pulled out all the stops for this date. But I almost felt like, wow, finally you're going to do something. So, but when he went to kiss me, he had planned such a nice night. I didn't want to ruin the night, but he kept pushing, what's wrong? I can sense something's wrong. And so finally I decided to be totally honest. And I just said, honestly, I have lost all my feelings for you.
Wow.
I really have nothing left at all. And I was getting ready for Dave to be defensive, because our pattern had been, I would say something like that, he would get angry, I would get angry and defensive, and it would just not go anywhere. But this night, he didn't get angry. It was very different.
And I think that's part of it as well. Talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it was different because I actually felt like God was speaking to me. This is where vertical marriage comes in. I was listening to Ann, but I felt, and again, I didn't hear an audible voice, but I just sensed from God's spirit to my spirit 2 words, and the words were shut up.
That's great.
Shut up and listen. And so I didn't say a word. I just sort of leaned in, and I heard Ann's heart, which was a journey of her bitterness.
Yeah, I told Dave, I think he was shocked, first of all, that I had said that. And I said, Dave, I started out so angry that you were gone. You were so busy, and I know what you're doing. You're doing great things for God and his kingdom. He was also the chaplain for the Detroit Lions, and he was on the road with them. And I said, after a while, my anger turned to bitterness, and then my bitterness turned to resentment, and then my resentment has gone to this, which is nothing. I feel totally isolated emotionally, physically, and I don't know where to go from here.
Well, and again, one of the things that you pointed out, I was going to get to that, is, of course, he's been the chaplain for the Detroit Lions. And before that, of course, a high school all-state quarterback, a college scholarship for football, and good-looking and successful. And so, Dave, in some respects, men were just probably listening to this saying, yeah, you got everything you want. What's her problem? And that was why it was so helpful for you to, now we're going to get into the idea of going vertical and spending some time just listening to her on the horizontal level, but also listening to God on the vertical level. True?
Yeah, and so it was really interesting. First I felt like God said, shut up, but then I heard one more word, and it was one word, repent. Wow. Repent. I heard that a couple times. Now, I'm a preacher. I'd preach that. I know what repent means, but it was really interesting. All God had to say was one word, and I knew exactly in one word everything he was trying to say to me, which was basically this. My walk with God at that time was lukewarm. I was just running from one event to another event. I hadn't opened the Word of God in months, except to get a sermon to preach to people at a Bible study or at a church. And, I just wasn't, God wasn't first in my life. And as Ann was sharing what was going on in our marriage, in one word, I knew God was saying this: if I'm not first in your life, this marriage, this horizontal relationship, will really never work. We have things to talk about, and we did need to talk, but until you get the vertical relationship first, and me first, this will never work. And so all that was in one word, and I knew it. And so I said to Ann as she finished talking, I said, we do need to talk, and I want to hear more, but before we do, I have to do something, and I need to do it right now. And I felt like I needed to pray, and I needed to be on my knees. And so I got on my knees in the front seat of a Honda Accord. Don't ask me how. But I just repented, and I just prayed out loud and said, God, I am sorry. I am lukewarm. I remember growing up in the church and just seeing lukewarm Christians and thinking, I'll never be that guy, and I was that guy.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dave and Ann Wilson. It is called Vertical Marriage, published by Zondervan. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Turn on a television or open up a newspaper and you will be treated to what best can be called climate change alarmism. We're told that we are headed for a climate catastrophe if we don't act immediately. Of course, we've heard that before. Back in 1970, Harvard biologist George Wald predicted civilization will end within 15 to 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. A few years later, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich predicted that 1 billion people would be starving to death by 2020. Climate change alarmism today succeeds first in discounting any critics and then by warning that dire consequences are just a few years off. Meteorologist Dr. Roy Spencer recently wrote about this first issue. He says climate change advocates claim that anyone who disagrees with them is a climate change denier. He says this is a straw man argument where you argue against something your opponent never claims. Spencer says he cannot think of a single credentialed, published skeptical climate scientist who doesn't believe in the existence of climate change. This includes Dr. Patrick Michaels, Dr. Richard Lenzin, and others who have been labeled climate change deniers. And the last 2 decades have been full of dire warnings. In his Oscar-winning documentary, Al Gore warned that sea levels would rise by 20 feet in the near future. So far, his prediction has been off by 20 feet or so. A 2005 conference of climate scientists and politicians meeting in London warned that the world has as little as 10 years before it would reach the point of no return on global warming. Alarmists and doomsayers have been with us for decades, warning of an environmental catastrophe that still hasn't happened. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Vertical marriage is our topic today as we talk with Dave and Ann Wilson, forward by Dennis and Barbara Rainey, and it is a book that you should be able to find in your local bookstore, published by Zondervan. Came out last year, and I think you should be able to benefit from some of the conversation. And so, if I can, for just a few minutes, Dave and Ann, let's talk about Chapter 4, The Vertical Starts Here. I think people have a little bit of an idea what you mean by going vertical, but let's get into it in a little bit more detail if we could.
Yeah, I mean, as we were talking, once I decided to put Jesus first, it was pretty interesting in that car. After I prayed, I turned to Ann to talk about our relationship, and then I look over and she's on her knees. And so it was really interesting what vertical looked like in our marriage.
Yes.
Well, it was really interesting. First of all, I was so shocked that Dave did that. He got on his knees and he was praying out loud. And, Proverbs says a gentle answer turns away wrath. And so when he didn't get defensive and he started to pray, I was instantly convicted and realized, I felt like God was nudging my heart at realizing that I had put so much of my focus on Dave, trying to find my happiness, my joy, my contentment through him, thinking if he would just get his act together, we could be great. And what I realized was that Dave had become my focus, my marriage had become an idol, and that had taken place over God. That was had become my priority. And so I got on my knees as well and just said, God, I'm sorry for making my marriage more important than you and Dave more important than you. He was never made or equipped to meet all my needs. You are that person that can meet those needs. And so it was a huge night for us. It was one that really changed. It was the beginning of changing because my feelings didn't instantly come back and we had a lot of work to do.
You know, you use an illustration there of being out of alignment, and I had to get my wheels aligned a while back, and there's a sense in which you can be kind of out of alignment in a marriage, but if you're both looking to the Lord, in some respects, it's like following these roads to the horizon. Eventually, you get back on the right track, and you'll actually begin to align your marriage once it's aligned vertically. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a great way to say it. Better than the way we said it in the book, I think. I mean, that's really good. And, you know, like you said in chapter 4, the thing we tried to write was, okay, we prayed in the car and we repented. Does that do it? You know, is that the end of it? No, it's really just the beginning. It's like you said, it's almost, I tried to put in that chapter almost a daily, weekly, yearly sort of alignment. It's like every day, man, I want to carve time alone with my relationship with God. Ann's doing the same thing. But also as a couple, we try to pray together every single day, go vertical together as a couple, which is putting that alignment back where it needs to be daily, then weekly, and then even yearly.
Well, again, that's kind of the key point there, because you can divert daily, DD, withdraw weekly, WW, and then abandon annually, AA. And I just think that's something to recognize. Short accounts, keeping focus on that. And so we've kind of set the stage now for this idea of vertical. Now you have a whole section 2, which I want to get to, on conflict and communication. And, of course, I know that as teachers at Family Life's Weekend to Remember, and certainly in your church at Kensington Community Church, you talk about the fact that you're going to have conflict. We come with different kind of expectations, different kinds of families, different kinds of emotional baggage. So the real question is, how do you address conflict? Can you help us out with that?
Well, that's a good one, because, like you said, everybody has conflict. Marriage, school, church, you name it, business. The problem is most of us don't know how to resolve conflict, and I was that guy. I mean, we got married. I grew up in a home where conflict was sort of ugly. There was alcohol, there was adultery, there was divorce. So I didn't know this, but I come into marriage and I run from conflict. I think it's bad and you avoid it. And, of course, you know, God's sense of humor is I marry a woman that loves conflict. She wants to step right into it and talk about it.
Well, and I think one of our first fights, Dave left the room, which I was shocked, because in my family, we just talked about it. We dealt with it. We've talked through everything. And so he got up and walked out of the room, and I had so little knowledge of how to resolve conflict. I yelled at him thinking this would help, but I said, come back here and fight me like a man. And that did not help.
No, probably did not. Yes. And so talk about the different ways to resolve it, because you have 4 patterns: win, yield, withdraw, resolve. I think we've already talked about a couple of those, but this is some of the problem, because conflict was dealt with differently in our family of origin. We maybe deal with conflict even different from that if we're in the business world. So in some respects, we got to come back to some kind of biblical principles, don't we, in terms of conflict resolution?
Yeah, and I would add this. I really believe how a couple handles conflict will determine the future of their marriage. I think it's that critical. It is so important, because we all do have conflict, and we need to get good at handling it.
And isn't it crazy that we all go through training, education, and some sort for a vocation for the future, but so many of us have had little or no training in how to resolve conflict or even how to have a great marriage.
And it's really one of the reasons we put that whole section in the book, is like we want to help people, give them tools that we've learned, you know, over the years. Again, we still have conflict. Do we resolve it? Yeah, we really do. We've gotten good at it. I think handling conflict really comes down to skill. That's one part of it. And there's that in the book. But the other big part of it is attitude, which is, you know, an attitude that says my spouse is as important or more important than I am. I really do want to hear what they're saying. And so one of the first things we write about in handling conflict that I need to get better at was just shut up and listen. I want to hear the story behind her story. What really is her beef? What is really going on, rather than just interrupting and making my point? I want to ask God to give me an attitude of listening and honoring her or him, and saying, I want to get to the bottom of that, and then starting to talk and speak the truth in love and communicate. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, at some point, one of us or both of us is going to have to let go and forgive. In other words, let go of that thing we're holding on to, that thing that offended us, and ask God to help us forgive as we've been forgiven by him.
Forgiveness, very important. Let me get to one other issue before I take a break, and that is anger. You have a chapter there, the shapes of wrath, kind of like the grapes of wrath, only the shapes of wrath. But how do you handle anger? And you talk about this idea of the ABCs, because, again, sooner or later, the conversation is going to heat up. Sooner or later, it's going to get thermonuclear. And so what do you do when you begin to cross that threshold and there is a fair amount of anger and statements being made that probably are not going to be helpful for a marriage? How do you handle that?
I think Dave has some really good things that he has learned through his anger process, and I'll let him do that. But the thing that I've learned is, one, I had to go to God first, and that's that vertical idea. Because Scripture says to speak the truth in love. Well, I was really good at speaking the truth, but it wasn't always loving. And so whatever came into my mind, it would just come out of my mouth. And often that would just create more conflict. And so one of the things that I had to do is, first of all, go to God and say, God, should I say this? And just kind of wait and not say anything. If you hear nothing, don't say it. That was hard for me. But then to ask, and God, if I should say it, how should I say it? And that's not easy either. But I think even taking the time to do that was big. And then Dave had some really good things.
Yeah, the hardest thing for me is Ann told me that she didn't want to bring things up in our marriage anymore because I always just blew up in anger. And, of course, I yelled at her and said, I don't get angry. And then there it was. It was like, oh, my gosh, she's right. And so as you read in the book, I went on sort of a study to say, where is this anger coming from? And probably the biggest thing I learned was anger's plugged into something. It is not just coming from the situation you're in. Sometimes it is, but often there's a deeper underlying thing. And so I went on this journey to discover, oh, my gosh, this is not just coming from Ann. There's things in my past, there's things that I've never dealt with that are sort of underlying reasons for this anger, and I had to sort of trace down that extension cord and find out what they're plugging into. And then once you find that out, you can do the ABCs, which I don't know if I have time to do it before the break.
Let's do it afterwards, because we're coming up to a break, and I want to get into that because this is something that's very practical. Of course, we've talked with Les Carter and some others about the issue of anger, but it's an important principle. And as couples understand that and don't have the problem of escalation or withdrawal, but, address the things that are happening in their marriage in an effective way, that's going to bring about some healing. So we're going to come back and continue our conversation with Dave and Ann Wilson. They are with us for a little bit longer as we talk about this book, Vertical Marriage. It is published by Zondervan, came out last year, probably should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But first of all, when we come back, we'll talk about how if you can't find it, you can order it online. And also, we have a link to their website, which I think you would want to know more about. So when we come back, we'll talk about some of the resources at their website, including the book and some other things that will be helpful in your marriage. We'll be back right after this.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called MediShare, and MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, MediShare members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with MediShare. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join MediShare anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dave and Ann Wilson. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me come to your website for just a minute. It's daveandannwilson.com, but people don't have to type all that out because we already have the link on our website, pointofview.net. But as people go there, there's information about the book where they can order it, events, the blog, I love that because the most recent one is actually related to one of the chapters in your book. All I Hear Is Boo. We'll come back to what that is in just a minute, and some other things. So if people would like to connect up with you, find out more about what you're doing, find out about the book, follow your blog, it's all available at the website, isn't it?
It's all there, and where we're speaking around the country as well. We'd love to have people come join us.
Okay. Let's, if we can, you were going to tell us a little bit about the shapes of wrath, if you will, the ABCs of handling anger. And again, I understand that. I mean, any of us that have played sports, sometimes, you just yell at somebody on the court, and then afterwards you're the best of buddies. You go out to, get ice cream if you're younger, or go out to get some Coke or something like that afterwards, but that doesn't work so well in a marriage, and you had to address this issue of anger. So what did you learn, Dan? Or Dave?
Well, when you're the Detroit Lions chaplain, you know a lot about anger.
Oh, boy.
I'm kidding, because we didn't win too many playoff games. In 33 seasons as their chaplain, we won one playoff game. So, anyway, I'm kidding around. But, in our marriage, it was a whole nother ballpark. Like you're saying, when anger's coming out against the people you love the most, it's something you better get control of. You better get to the root of, and that's what I needed to do. Yeah, it's toxic, and I was hurting my wife and my kids, not with physical abuse, but I was just, I couldn't understand why I was so angry. And one of the things I discovered to get a grip on my anger was the ABCs. I just wrote them out as simple. A is just admit you're angry, and it sounds like a step that's not important, but especially to followers of Jesus, I think it's important because I think sometimes we tend to think that anger is a sin, and it's not a sin. It can lead to sin if we don't control it or understand it or get a grip on it, but it's a God-given emotion. It actually can be a motivation to really getting involved in something. So the first thing I do is say, I am angry. B in ABC is backtrack to the first emotion. And one of the things I discovered about anger was it's really what psychologists call a second emotion. It's not often the first emotion you experience. We skip over an emotion that's uncomfortable to us. Like for me, emotional hurt was not something I did well. I don't cry a lot. I don't, I should, but I don't. And so I would skip right past that and blow up in anger. And then realize that, oh my gosh, I got to backtrack and go, okay, why am I angry right now? I'm not really mad at Ann. She said something that hurt me, and I need to deal with that. So I backtrack and go, okay, here's the emotion I skipped. And then C is confess it appropriately. There are inappropriate and appropriate ways to handle and confess your anger. Yelling and screaming is not an appropriate way. It's like, wait a minute, I got to get a grip here. I understand it isn't even anger I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with hurt. So I need to communicate to Ann and say, okay, let's talk about what we just, what just happened. I felt hurt when you said this. Again, that could escalate. It sounds so easy. In the middle of it is not so easy. But again, that's where you go vertical and you say, God, help me. God, give me power to settle down, to calm down and, sort of deal with this conflict and this anger as an adult. And then hopefully at the very end of the day, you got to get to a place where God gives you the power to forgive, maybe even yourself, but especially someone else, to get to resolution.
That gets us into this idea of life-changing words. And, of course, 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about encouraging one another. And one of the blog posts, matter of fact, the most recent one, All I Hear Is Boo, it's also, of course, one of the chapters. And I love how you actually put that together, Dave, because you said, when you're growing up, your coach says, hey, good job. Your parents say, good job, boy. A little bit later, hey, you're the man, you're the champion. And then all of a sudden you say, but ladies, after we've been married a while, men walk in the door after a long, hard day, and all we hear is boo. And that's actually one of the chapters in the book, but it's also one of your blog posts. Speak to that issue for a minute, Ann, if you might.
Well, it's funny. It wasn't funny at the time because Dave shared your exact words we were speaking at a MOPS, Mothers of Preschoolers, and we were speaking, and Dave just went off and said all of that to these women. And when he got to the part, and at one point he said, and then Ann chose me from all the other men in the world. She basically said, I choose you, Dave Wilson, because you're the man. Yay, cheer. And then when he said the part about, but then after a while we get married, we walk in the door and all we hear is boo, he looked back at me and I'm thinking, what? I had no idea he was going to share that. So on the way home, that was not a fun ride home.
I can imagine.
I said to Dave, what was that? And he said, I don't know. It just came out.
I said, that was God. God gave me that. That's what I said.
I wouldn't blame God for that, but that is a good line. Yeah.
Well, and I said, I'm not booing you. I'm helping you. Because honestly, I felt like I was trying to help him, and I thought helping him would be pointing out maybe weaknesses or maybe how he could be better at something, and I thought that was motivating him. But I only came to find out that was communicating a sense of being booed at.
Yeah, and as you know, Kerby, men often don't respond well to, being complained and critiqued. It didn't motivate me at all. I mean, it was the opposite. I sort of wanted to be worse than she even said I was. And here's the good news. Over time, she became, and she is today, my biggest cheerleader. It's unbelievable. Right. She believes in me. She speaks words of life to me. And again, that didn't change overnight. But I tell you what, she started to just speak life to me, and it changed me. I started to become the man she said I was. I wasn't that man yet. She thought I was good, and I wasn't. And I wanted to become that man. And I tell you what, I've watched her do that with our sons. And I really think when a man is respected and cheered, he becomes a much better man. And it's the same thing for women as they're cherished. But that was a learning for us that changed our marriage.
And one of the things we oftentimes point out is a man needs to feel admired, respected, and those kinds of things. But Ann, since we were starting with you, let's come back to that. What every wife longs for. Part of the difficulty, and we've talked about this on this program before, is men look at women and think they have the same emotional and spiritual needs that they do, and vice versa. So educate the men for just a minute. What does a wife really long for?
I think each wife, we long to be cherished, but I also think that looks different for every single woman.
Because they're complicated.
In some ways we are, but it might look very different for me than another person. But I will tell you, I think that we would all agree as women that we long to be pursued. And we long for our husbands to continue to pursue us even after we've been married a while. And that doesn't always happen, because I know that in our marriage, I felt like Dave did pursue me while we were dating. But then after we were married, I felt like he was pursuing his career or all the other things on his calendar way more than our relationship. And that felt like it felt hurtful.
And when, again, you just feel like you're at the best a box for a to-do list, and the box is fairly far down, that doesn't feel pursued. Given the fact that when oftentimes there's a courtship situation, they're doing everything they can to pursue you. But even going back to that 10th year anniversary, this guy's bringing roses. He's doing everything right, but, again, there were some other things going on. So this idea of being pursued versus this idea that once I've captured my wife, I put him on the mantle like one of Dave's trophies, maybe. And that's not a good thing, right?
Yeah, and I would just, I would say to the men out there, if they're like me, I think I just got lazy.
Yeah.
I pursued her, and I really went after her, and busy, and I started pursuing other things with a passion that I wasn't bringing back to my home. It's almost like you want to say to the typical guy, man, if you brought the energy to your marriage that you bring to fantasy football, your wife would feel cherished. But, it sort of is that. Guys often understand what cherish looks like in other areas. We cherish. I have I'm a guitar player, so I take care of my guitars. I have a motorcycle. I study it. I protect it. I won't let anybody touch it. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I took that kind of cherish to my wife, protected her, studied her, learned her, she would feel loved. And that's what I need to do. That is loving her as Christ loved the church. It's like, I'm going to lay down my life to make sure she feels cherished and loved with an energy that she deserves. And so that's just basically, in some ways, just say, I'm not going to be lazy here. This is the most important relationship in my life. I'm going to go after it with everything I got.
Let's take a break. When we come back, there's a section here on intimacy. We'll talk about that briefly. And then finally, living vertical. What does that look like? All in, victory through surrender. We have a lot more to cover. We'll try to do as best we can in the next few minutes. But again, if you're interested, the book's entitled Vertical Marriage. Dave and Ann Wilson with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1925, the Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial was erected to honor the 49 men of Prince George's County, Maryland, who gave their lives in World War I. It stands outside of Washington, D.C., in the median near the National Defense Highway. This memorial, one of the oldest memorials on U.S. soil to honor the fallen of World War I, has stood without complaint for nearly a century. For the first time in over 9 decades, the American Humanist Association voiced a complaint. They filed a federal lawsuit seeking to topple the memorial because those who erected it chose the shape of a cross to honor the fallen. One of the mothers who supported the memorial early on noted to her senator that her son died and was buried in Europe. Though she could not visit his grave there, she said, she considered the Bladensburg World War I memorial to be her son's grave marker close to home. First Liberty Institute, along with our volunteer attorneys at the law firm of Jones Day, represents the American Legion who erected the memorial in 1925. This memorial was erected to honor heroes who gave their lives in defense of freedom. To tear this memorial down now would not only desecrate their memory, it would demonstrate a level of hostility to religion that our founding fathers warned against. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dave and Ann Wilson with us as we talk about vertical marriage. It is published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to their website. And you have a whole section here on intimacy. And I was just thinking about, in some respects, it relates a little bit to even our previous conversation we had an earlier hour on the digital distractions that we have. If you think about it, we have, of course, sexual distractions we have, and in some respects, it's always been important to have intimacy in your marriage, but at a time when there are so many other things that can distract you and lead you away and tempt you, it becomes even more important, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think I look at that and I think that I believe that we're all in a spiritual battle. And that the enemy, that's one of his ploys, is to get us distracted apart from our marital vows and our marital relationship. And even that's so true in intimacy of getting us to wander off into an area that God hasn't intended us to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ann wrote in the book a quote. I think it says, Satan will do anything he can. How's it go?
I really felt like this, that Satan will do anything in his power to get us to have sex before we're married. But then Satan will do everything in his power to get us not to have sex in our marriage because there's a sense of holiness and beauty in our sexual relationship that was God ordained and God created. And there's a oneness that happens, a oneness of the soul that is beautiful. It unites us. It draws us together. And so it makes sense that Satan would want us to be divided in this area. And it's very easy to be divided, especially when the relationship is not doing well. And I would say that's especially true for a woman.
Well, again, just some great material there as well in the website, as well as in the book. And I thought just for the last couple of minutes, so we might talk about what this means to live vertical, because we've been talking about it, but can you give us some maybe some practical ideas? The first chapter, of course, is all in. And even in our own church lately, we've been talking about being all in, and certainly that's important in terms of being all in our spiritual life. What does it look like to be all in your marriage?
You know, I think it really does come back to the commitment you bring to the wedding day. I mean, I do a lot of weddings as a pastor. I've never met a couple who stands at the altar and says, yeah, we're going to try a little bit and see how it works. I'll give about 20, 30%. I mean, they are all in. They look at you with those eyes, and, there's nothing going to deter them from having the greatest marriage ever. And you see them a year or two later, and they've lost the fire. They've lost the passion. I think in a lot of ways it's the secret we talk about in the book. It's like they thought they would find life from their spouse or from their marriage. And, we let each other down. It's going to happen to everybody. And so many couples think, well, I just married the wrong person. I got to find the right person who will bring me that happiness I thought this person would bring me. And we say the secret is you didn't marry the wrong person. You're looking in the wrong place. The only way you're going to find the joy, the happiness, the fulfillment you thought you would get horizontally from a person or a job or an amount of money or some pleasure, you're never going to get on this planet. It's never going to totally satisfy. It's good, but it's not ever going to fill your hole in your soul. That has to come from your Creator, God. And so that's what vertical means. When you discover the depth and the joy of a relationship in Jesus, and it's real, and it's something that's not talked about but is actual in your life, man, oh man, you come back to your marriage totally different. I'm no longer a husband that needs my wife to meet my needs. My needs have been met in my relationship with Christ, and so I'm filled up with the living water. I come back to Ann, what? I'm a giver now. I'm a server. I am Christ to her rather than demanding that she meet my needs. It's totally a different way to do marriage.
Well, and that kind of gets into one of the things you talk about in your last chapter about the relationship phases. And this is something I'm beginning to think I want to pass on to those if I do marriage counseling or even do marriages, because lots of times you meet these couples either in the romantic phase or the excited phase, and those are the two before it, R and E. But then you have the REDO, and that's the disappointed phase, and then the O or the over phase. And you just run into a lot of people that they've just got stars in their eyes. They're convinced that they will always have love, that everything will always be exciting, that they'll just not be able to ever get out of that emotional experience that they're having as they are first courting and then getting married. And then when they don't have the feelings, as you heard in that car that night, they say, well, I guess we got to give up. And that's the time in which you really need to be persistent and recognize that there are couples every day that go to divorce courts over problems that other couples have decided to work through and deepen their marriage and relationship. So it seems to me that it's probably important to warn individuals that there's going to be a time when you're not going to have the excitement that you have in this marriage relationship right now or in this courtship relationship. But that's where I think it's most important to make sure that you have that vertical marriage.
Yeah, exactly. It's true in our walk with God as well. We lose that first love. And you look at the book of Revelation where Jesus says, if you lose your first love, what's he tell us to do? It's really interesting in our walk with God. He says, repent, heard that word before, and do the things you did at first. And so often couples think, well, I've lost that feeling of love, it must be over. And it's like, no, repent and go back and do the things you once did. So if you want the love you once had, do the things you once did. Start dating again. Start forgiving one another again. Start talking again. It's like, it isn't, feel your way back into it. It's like act your way back into it, and the feelings will come later. When I say, man, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this marriage work, let's go back and do the things we used to do. When is the last time we really talked? When is the last time we went out on a date? Let's cultivate some of those disciplines and patterns in our life, spiritually, vertically, but then with each other, and that begins the redo process. I start to do a mulligan and start over again.
Very good. Just before we let you go, one more time, I wanted to direct people to your website, daveandannwilson.com. Don't have to type all that out because we already have the link there, but there is an opportunity for people to read your blog, to get the book, maybe connect up with some of the events that you're involved with. Maybe they'd like to have you come and speak. And if nothing else, I do encourage any of our listeners, if they've never been to Family Life's Weekend to Remember, that's just another great place where they'll have a chance to hear you two speak from time to time. So talk about one more time what's available on the website. So as our listeners go there, they'll be able to connect up with you.
Yeah, we tried to just make it a place to help couples. So anything you need is probably there, from blogs to podcasts to information about where we're speaking. We're doing Family Lives in Chicago and Orlando this spring. And then just follow us on Facebook, Dave Ann Wilson, or Twitter or Instagram, and reach out to us, and we'd love to help you, or go to Amazon and get the book and then reach out to us, and we're here to help. We want to bring hope and help to marriages and families and change legacies.
Well, again, I hope your Detroit Lions do a little bit better, the Detroit Tigers and all the others. But nevertheless, it has been just great to have you with us today here on Point of View. Thank you for giving us an hour. Thank you for writing the book, and we wish you well, and look forward to maybe an opportunity to connect up with you at one of those weekends to remember.
I'd love to, Kerby. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will take a break, and if you find yourself saying, okay, I need some more information, what was the name of that book again? Well, it's called Vertical Marriage, or, of course, you don't have to worry about that. We have that information on our website. Of course, Drew Dyck was with us the first hour, in which we talked about self-control. Your future self will thank you. I think you will appreciate that as well. So all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let me mention one more time, of course, my Viewpoints commentary today is on climate change alarmism, and it's got some good material there by Dr. Roy Spencer, who has been on the program with us, saying that oftentimes when people are criticizing people as climate change deniers, he's saying, nobody I know is. He's a meteorologist, all the others are. They recognize climate is changing. They just don't agree with some of the alarmism. And so I think that's a good piece for you to read. Also, as I mentioned before, we're heading to Israel in October, but we really need your commitment now, because as we fill up the buses and the hotel rooms and even the plane flights, it's all over. So if you'd like to know more, go to the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our weekend edition right here on Point of View.
Question, do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare, and they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.